Today I'm speaking to Rachael Minott, Inclusion and Change Manager at the National Archives, because I think she has a brilliant approach to decolonial curatorial practice. This is because it is continually developing in response to her experimental, innovative and genuinely collaborative work that empowers people and their stories within the context of a museum. It's an approach that inspires a lot of people, including me. Hello, we're very lucky to have Rachael Minott here with us today. Could you introduce yourself to us, please?
My name is Rachael Minott. I am a Jamaican-born artist, researcher and curator. I currently work at the Horniman Museum and Gardens as curator of anthropology, and I am a visual artist working on Jamaican national representation as a form of exploration, and I'm also a board member for the Museum Association.
So you're not very busy, really?
No, I've got lots of free time.
I'm glad you've been able to come and join me today. But I just wanted to start from the very basic. And I wondered, what was it that drew you to working in the museum sector particularly? I mean, obviously you've mentioned that you're an artist. So what was it that made you decide museums? That's really for me.
I always joke to say that I fell into museums accidentally. And I'm one of the few people that I know who went into museums for the money. I was following the money.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So I did a degree in art and art history from the University of Reading. And my art practice was really looking at Jamaica. And it was looking at the history of Jamaica and the things I knew, and I wanted to represent other people. And so I used to make fake museum artifacts or artifacts, and then I'd make up object biographies about them. And then I would tell people as if it was real. So then I made a fake gallery to present my artwork called the International Gallery of Jamaica. And then the lecturers basically told me that they couldn't judge my work because they didn't know the history of Jamaica enough to know where I was lying, because I'd intertwine the truth and lies in my practice. And so then I started holding seminars and conferences as the Institute of Jamaica, inviting real academics to come and speak about Jamaica so that I could provide the context so that I could be graded. And then I approached Reading Museum to display my work, to kind of put it in a museum context so that I could have the images to back up this fake museum. And then at the end of my degree, I made a fake museum.
Oh my goodness.
And so people came in and they saw the videos from the conferences and they saw the objects and they read the biographies, and I gave them a booklet, like a catalogue to go through. And Reading Museum had an internship, a paid internship at the end of the degree, and I applied for it. And because I'd done the project with them before, they had recognized me. And so I ended up an intern there in their world art department, researching Baptist missionary objects and writing a report upon the potential future use of them within the museum.
That's really fascinating, actually. So it's a really nice link between your artwork that you still produce and also the sort of entry into museums and the sort of intersection between both of those.
Yeah. I remember the first time someone let me write an object label, and I thought, if they knew my practice, they would not let me do this. They would not trust that I was telling the truth, because all I ever did was mix the truth and my agenda.
Well, see, this is it, because people always assume that the museum is, I'm going to use the word, neutral space. And obviously it's not. It never has been, and it never can be.
Yeah.
So actually when you're presenting a label in which so many different things are entwined, dare I say it's sort of truer than the whole neutral museum label.
Yeah.
So that's actually a really interesting approach. And also hopefully it'll make people really think about and challenge what they're seeing and what they're reading on these labels.
That was my whole point, was to make people self-conscious about how little they did know. Because I presented one of my first artworks and I said, oh, this object was discovered by Christopher Columbus and was brought as a gift for Queen Isabella, and it was damaged on the journey, and they realized that it wasn't actually made of gold, and so then they put it in storage forever until it eventually came to the museum. And someone read it and was like, oh my God, is this true? I was like, you literally saw me make it.
God. I think that's a really powerful statement, actually, because so many people, if it's in a museum, they look at it and they assume that they must believe every single thing, and obviously you don't. But please challenge what you see, people. Just moving on a tiny bit, because you actually did SOCL training, and I wondered if you could tell me a bit more about that, because it was quite a large cohort of people did that training, and they're doing some really innovative work at the moment.
Yeah.
And it's a very new way for people to actually enter the museum sector, which is quite a conservative space still. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your experience with that.
Yeah, so SOCL stands for Sharing Our Cultural Life, and I was part of the third cohort of it. And it's a pro-diversity scheme. It's now run by Culture and I think it's called Museum School. But back then it was run by Cultural Cooperation, who became Culture and. And there were about 12 in my year, and we were placed across different institutions across England. So some were up in Newcastle, Portsmouth, but the large majority of us were in London. And we were on traineeships. So basically we were to get... The idea was that we got some sort of qualification, but really what you were getting was a year's worth of paid experience within the museum sector, where you were treated as a trainee, and so you had professional development built in.
Oh, that's fantastic. And also I like the idea of paid, because there are so many volunteers in the sector. I don't like the idea of not paying someone for their labour.
Yeah. And it's easy. I mean, you can volunteer in different stages of your life, in different scenarios where
Absolutely,
it's simpler.
yeah.
But like I said, I followed the money. So I did my internship.
Sorry,
I know.
can't
it's
get
so
over
funny.
that.
I did my internship, which was paid. And then before that internship finished, my then supervisor put the application in front of me and said, I think you should go for this because it sounds like you. I mean, the payment wasn't great. It was, I think at the time, 13,500 for the year.
Oh my goodness.
And I was commuting into London. So there's still barriers to access that, but at least I was being paid.
Absolutely.
If I had to volunteer, I would have left. I would have just taken that internship and been like, that was great, let me carry on in some other fashion. So it was great, and then it had this professional development aspect of it. And within that, we did reciprocal visits. So we visited all the other institutions with our trainees. Not all of them. So you had like 4 people you had to visit, or that would visit you. And basically what you had was somebody in the inside explaining you exactly how things worked at their institution, and you could compare and contrast. And for me, that was something really important, which I've taken throughout my career. I now make it a point of fact that if I get into a new job, I invite people to come talk to me about how it's run in my institution, and then I visit them.
What was it that you particularly got out of that? Because I think a lot of people don't do that at all.
No. It was interesting to see how many similar issues there were, but also how many different ways that you approach things, but also just kind of different systems. So I'm very interested in databases. And I was really interested to see how people tackled documentation in different ways, which has been really important to me because we might get into it later, but one of the things I'm really interested in is decolonizing as a practice. And for me, at the heart of that is the database. And so I'm really interested in seeing different people's way of collections management and information storage and prioritizing information.
That's a really important point, because I think a lot of times, once again, a database is seen as a neutral space of very objective information, and some of it is what size is something, what kind of material is it made from, but also I think the interpretation and the contextualization of that material is, I think that's where things get quite exciting actually.
Yeah.
After your SOCL experience, the London Transport Museum hired you as their Assistant Contemporary Collecting Curator. You've always had a lot of very cool titles, actually, which is very nice. And you had the opportunity to review their contemporary collecting procedures. That's really unusual, because I think a lot of people still don't reflect that carefully on what they're acquiring and why, and also what it'll mean for their future collections or collecting. What did you take away from that particular experience, and how has it influenced or led you to develop your own collecting practices as a curator in other institutions, because you've at this point worked in quite a few really extraordinary institutions?
So London Transport Museum is where I did my traineeship as well. So I had a great foundation in terms of what their collections were like, the problems they faced, because you learn so much about something when someone takes the time to introduce it to you, because they also then get a chance to reflect on what it means to them. And people who've worked in places for years who take a chance to tell you about it give you such a wealth of information. So the fact that I did my traineeship there really helped me to be able to work in the contemporary collecting department after that. And I worked with a really great practitioner, Ellie Miles, and she was the contemporary collecting curator and I was her assistant. So what was really interesting for that was to think really creatively about how we approached collecting, because a lot of I think it was the end of a period for a lot of institutions where this kind of project came up, where there had been like an absolute stoppage on proactively collecting. There was a lot of responsive collecting or accepting donations, which still happens actually for a lot of people's collecting development policies. So it was great to think about in the London Transport Museum, with London Transport being such a really heavily digital world now, and everything we'd done previously had been really, really paper-based, very ephemeral, to think about kind of social media as a new form of ephemera, or understanding that transport developments across London are really a social situation. They're not entirely technological moments. They're actually really interesting controversies often about lots of things people dislike about the process, or things that get lost in the translation of the history. So, for example, we'd have stuff about the Victoria Line, and everything in the collection would be talking kind of really praising about it. But then in the scenario we're looking around, we saw Crossrail 2 coming through and the Elizabeth Line, and we're like, this is not a simple narrative. This is not everybody's going to agree on things. So it was great to kind of think about how we would collect stories from individuals who were in the midst of all the controversy in a way that protected them. So they felt free to give us kind of an authentic oral history, but also allowed us to get the breadth of the narrative. So we created a lot of policies about how people could be like donors of stories, but they went out and they collected up the stories, brought them back to us, and then we would bring them to our acquisitions meeting. So it was really much about dispersing power, which has affected me going forward with everything. I mean, I don't like to work alone. I'm very much about collaboration. I really don't like the idea of any single person holding authority, especially on things I don't know that much about. I never knew that much about transport. It was always quite ironic that I was in a curatorial department. When people asked me what type of car I drove, I said green.
I love it. Okay.
So then I would never pretend I was ever going to be the expert. So it was all about learning that actually as a curator, you can be a facilitator of other people's expertise.
Completely. Museums don't always fit the stereotype. When you think of a particular museum, it doesn't mean that what you perceive them to collect and display is all that they do. I think a lot of museums, actually, when you start scratching beneath the surface, are doing some really interesting, exciting work on collecting other things. Like you mentioned, collecting oral histories. It's not something I wouldn't necessarily think about. I would assume large, trains essentially, and posters, and maybe even like old tickets and things like that.
Those are in the collection.
I'm sure they have loads of those as well.
Yeah, I mean, London Transport Museum had a very interesting collection. I think the weirdest thing was that they had like a cake from like the Victoria Line opening that we had to like make sure we didn't get infested.
That's so random. I like that. After you finished at the London Transport Museum, it's almost like you exploded onto the scene in the most positive way, because you co-curated two very timely, very important and innovative exhibitions. One was the experimental The Past Is Now, Birmingham and the British Empire. I obviously went to visit this exhibition, and I remember going through the galleries and very beautiful pre-Raphaelite paintings. And then I went into one of the most emotionally loud spaces I've ever entered. And it was challenging, it was visceral, and I enjoyed every minute, actually. Although it was challenging to sort of go around and read and really be confronted with the fact that this material is not neutral. It is not free of emotion. Not, historically, and certainly not now.
Yeah.
I wondered, how do you go about approaching that kind of really complicated, very emotional and very charged material and exhibition, especially given that your previous experience was London Transport Museum, so-called training, a Jamaican institution.
Yeah.
How did that happen? And how did you do it, basically?
So when I was at London Transport Museum, I had this opportunity to do a display for Black History Month at the end of my traineeship. And I was given full rein to do the whole exhibition. So my initial task was to do something for one day with no budget and no space. And
Welcome to the museum sector.
I was so offended. And I was the most junior person in the room, but I was one of the only people of colour in the team. And I actually went around and I got all of this support internally to do a much bigger exhibition. So I got a whole gallery. We did an exhibition about Black history narrative of London Transport, which is amazing. It's a really important story for immigration, especially because people were directly recruited from the Caribbean to work for the London transport system. And there's lots of kind of stories of kind of battlefronts of fighting prejudice. But I realised that I didn't want to be a transport curator. I really wanted to be able to talk about Jamaica and the Caribbean more. So I actually left Land Transport Museum to do my master's degree in Arts of Africa, Oceania and the Americas, because my practice had always been as an artist, reflecting on Jamaica by looking at Europe, mapping it against European art movements to kind of make authentic seeming art objects that fit into the canon. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to look around the rest of the world, to look back at Jamaica, to kind of break this very colonial relationship.
I guess also getting past the stereotype.
Yeah, and the kind of Jamaica's national anthem is Out of Many One People, but there still tends to be this tendency of looking at it as something as black and white history rather than even acknowledging the influence of Asia or the rest of Europe, or even kind of thinking about Jamaica as an island and then understanding that within Central America or Oceania. There's a lot more ways to look at it, and that's what I wanted to do. And that kind of gave me this academic backing, but it was really frustrating again because it was so colonial in how it was taught. And actually I wasn't taught about the Caribbean at all because someone told me that it didn't have a material culture.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And that it would require too much context to talk about the Caribbean because they'd have to talk about 150 years to explain the Black Atlantic before they even talked about the Caribbean now.
I'm just to let you know, I'm sitting here with my mouth hanging open. That's quite special.
Yeah, and I was actually treated as ridiculous for asking about this in my feedback. So anyways, I wrote my dissertation on it because I wanted to be able to talk about Jamaica, so I looked at national representation post-colonialism. So I was really looking at political decolonizing and how that left a visual impact and how it marked and mapped visually. And then I got the opportunity to apply for this position as a research assistant for the Pastors now. It wasn't called that at the time, it was just called Birmingham in the British Empire. I actually started that project a week after I came back from Jamaica doing my research, and I was still doing my master's thesis. My God. So I commuted between Norwich and Birmingham for the last month of my degree, but it made it really fresh. So I had all this decolonial theory like at the forefront of my mind. I was the only full-time member of staff on that project. So I was one of the most junior people, but I was the only full-time dedicated staff member to it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and so that made me really central to the project. Yeah. So the project was led by Sarah Wajid, and she and I were the only two women of colour internally working on it, and all of the participants were women of colour. And that really helped a lot of the dynamics, actually, because it was really interesting to be able to be that challenging and be that open and kind of take the conversation about institutional racism or colonialism from an introductory conversation to a really sophisticated level without really needing to fill in all the gaps between. We had a lot of allies who were white European and were really important and really interesting and worked really hard on this project. But there was a strong kind of positioning that came about, which was that we worked with these external co-curators, and they were really great at agitating and asking really difficult questions. And I like to call them the outsider activists. And they were able to put lots of pressure on us to kind of say, like, why? And we'd be, me and Sarah, the internal activists, where we wanted to make change, but we were really acutely aware of the labour of our co-workers and actually how much they cared and were trying, but might not necessarily have the language or feel appropriate to kind of make the changes they want to make.
I think also the historical knowledge, because you need to contextualise.
Or the emotional resonance.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And the hard bit is actually bringing all of that together.
Yeah.
And you're right, it needs different voices to bring it together, actually.
But then we also had the allies who were really important, and then we had top-down buy-in from the director of the museum. So we were basically given permission to be as loud and as confrontational as we wanted to. And because the aim of that gallery was to elicit conversations between two sets of people who don't have conversations. So we knew we were always going to upset somebody. Mm-hmm. So we decided to not worry about that.
Well, that's hard, though. You say that and you're smiling, but that's not an easy thing to do, especially in the museum sector, which is actually very... it's actually quite conservative in many ways.
Yeah, I mean, it was not easy to do. It was literally, I think we kept trying to please everybody. And then one day, I remember very clearly me and Sarah just looking at each other being like, everybody's going to be upset with us. Let's just accept that and move on.
Wow.
So we had like a whole different way of writing that interpretation, actually. We had posed them a model that we saw in Boston in terms of the way that Boston Museum had kind of assumed a black female audience. You could hear that in the way that they wrote. And we said, okay, let's do that. Let's assume a black female audience member as our like person that we're having a conversation with. And then as co-curators, like everybody writes down like bullet points of how we want the text to be written. And then we will go back and we'll put it within this institutional voice that's just pointed at a different direction. And we'll make the text work. And so we thought we'd done that. And we like wrote it all out. And then we presented it back to co-curators who were like, this is awful. You've done exactly what you said you weren't going to do. You're so assuming, still a white male audience member. You've really changed your position and kind of like took away the violence. Like we hedged our bets. We didn't even notice we were doing it. We were so institutionalized.
Yeah.
And basically we took the text that they'd written and we took the text that we'd written and we read them side by side. And we're like, oh my God, we did that. We were totally like softening everything. And we didn't notice it until we saw theirs behind. So we made the position at that point that we would absolutely use their voice. We would tweak it so that it was accessible, and that was it. And we got it fact-checked by decolonial academics who were within our like network. I mean, the funniest one was we'd written something about Joseph Chamberlain, and then one of the co-curators wrote, Joseph Chamberlain was a racist. And we're like, okay, maybe we have to say he's prejudiced because he's clearly like also prejudiced against the Dutch.
Right.
So maybe we just call him prejudiced in general. And then the academic was like, no, he was a racist.
So that's a really thing, is it's such a powerful word. And as you say, we're so used to sort of self-editing, especially when it comes to writing labels. I've written more labels than I ever thought I would write. And you're right, I sort of turn into a slightly different person when I sit down and write a label. I'm given my, 70 odd words. And all of a sudden, I don't know, the activist part of me essentially switches off. And I'm like, this stone object was created and then blah, 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 blah. And it was used for da, 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 da. Essentially the end. And the circumstances around its discovery, what it means now, how different people look at it and how they interpret it, sort of goes slightly out of the window.
Yeah.
And I recently, actually, it's a Birmingham academic, that was Sadia Qureshi, whose work I've recently started reading called Peoples on Parade. And it's really made me sit back and start to reevaluate what I use an object for. Because it is essentially performing. It's standing in for, whatever it is a creator might want it to stand in for, particular sort of artistic style, or actually an entire region, an entire people. And it's only when you step back and really think about what you are doing and how you are doing it that this kind of conversation happens, or rather the conversation you had with your co-curators and Sarah as well. And that's actually a really powerful moment, because it's not easy to change like that, and it's not easy for other people to accept that kind of change, because I think a lot of us across the sector are actually quite risk averse because it's terrifying.
Well, it's also to do with our training as curators. Like I remember very distinctly when I first started writing in museums, people were like, "Oh, I can hear your voice. You have to use the institution's voice." And I'd go back and I'd read lots of things I've written in academic settings as well as in like museums, where I'll be like, "Oh, this is really interesting. I feel like I used to know this." And I'm like, "Oh, I wrote it." And like I've just so detached from it. It's not me. It's like it's an institution's voice through me. I'm just like a microphone.
And it's almost not even an institution. It's almost nobody's voice.
Yeah, and then
masquerading as a neutral voice, and that's almost the worst part of it.
And then I know that whenever I read like Jamaican history that's neutral, I get so mad. I'm like, someone's just regurgitating some really racist archives, and they're saying like, it could be this or it could be that, and you're like, no, you can land pretty like thoroughly on one side now. You do not need to create so much balance.
Absolutely, and also embrace what it is, and if it's racist, embrace the fact it is racist.
Yeah, but I think people are getting more comfortable saying that now, and some people aren't. Obviously, I use it very regularly. I'm not worried about it anymore. I'm like, this is an aspect of our reality, and we all need to kind of just call it by its name.
I'm slowly getting there. I'm not quite there yet in using it freely, but I'm on my way.
The other thing that was really strange is when I learned to say like white privilege in a room of where I'm the only person of color, and kind of look and you see this sort of like whiplash, and you're like, okay, so you see what you just had right there, that's called white fragility.
I love it. I've never done that yet.
It's quite fun. Don't let me fool you. There's lots of consequences of doing that. there is repercussions to that, and you are sometimes treated as difficult or more defensive than needing to be. I get that a lot, actually. And when I first came into museums, everyone used to be like, "Oh, Rachel, she's such a sunshine, like a really great person to be in the office. She just brings joy." And now they're like, "Oh, Rachel, you're really great, critical friend. And you never let anyone off the hook." And it's always great because I can't sit easy around you. And I'm like, when did that change? Am I not still sunshining? I'm still smiling at you guys.
Maybe it was Birmingham.
Maybe 100%
It had to have been Birmingham.
It was Birmingham.
Actually, we talk about some of the criticism that came your way. Some journalists, I'm not naming any papers, really latched onto this exhibition, and it wasn't especially positive. How did you react and respond to that? Because as someone who standing at the outside, I wasn't involved in the project, it looked like an avalanche of criticism, and I really wondered, how did you cope with that, and did it have an impact on your later work?
So, no, actually, I think we had very little criticism in regards to what I thought we would have. We had a lot of people kind of mentioning things or asking us a lot of questions, but we had one really big article about the project, but I knew exactly where it came from. The person who wrote that article had sent in that exact article as an email complaint. Then had a meeting with one of the directors of the museum where they had their questions answered, and then they carried on and said, "I'm still going to press." And we actually took it as an opportunity to go through the comments of that, which is when we got all of the kind of detailed critique from people who would never come to our exhibition. Visitors we'd see come in, see what it's all about, and back out. We actually got to hear their voice. And the whole point was that we were trying to platform different perspectives on this to show that it wasn't neutral. That was a statement from the beginning of the exhibition. This is not a neutral story. No two people experience the British Empire in the same way. And so it was great to have that and to collect that, because we had a whiteboard in the gallery as well where people wrote different comments, and we got a bit of the back and forth, a bit of conversation. Got a lot of instances where people were like, "I'm really proud of the empire," or the empire really, it brought, technology and education around the world. And it's the narratives that are actually typical of what you'd see in a museum, which is why the passes now stood out. Instead of saying, the railways were brought to India, you kind of
always the railways.
Always the railways. It was more about the other narratives. So it was great to have that kind of conversation back and forth a bit, and in the newspaper. It was great to have the evidence that actually we weren't just taking it easy. We were taking a stance, and actually, if we were going to take a stance, we needed to upset a right-wing newspaper, right? Basically.
You did it. Well done. It's interesting to see other people in other institutions saying that it was that one that gave them the courage to challenge their own approaches, and you can see it now. Sarah talked a bit about the Pitt Rivers Museum, for example, and some of the creators there reference back to the past is now, saying, we were inspired by that. That must feel pretty damn good.
Yeah, considering all in all, it took us 3 months.
Really?
Yeah, we recruited our co-curators at the beginning of June. I was recruited midway through June, so they recruited before me. And then October, we opened the gallery.
I'm really surprised.
So it was experimental. It was fast. We had a lot of support, and a lot of people kind of gave extra time and extra effort. But it was emotionally harrowing to go through all that so quickly as well, and exhausting. And then it just had this ripple effect. Some of the main critique we get about museums is that they're too slow, and actually that was proof to me. I was like, it is. If we did this in a time scale as a normal exhibition, it would have been filtered down. The tone would have been changed. We would have made lots of different decisions. It would have been 5 different types of exhibitions in between. And then me and Sarah talked about it, and we talked about it really honestly. We did not want to just say, "Hey, this was easy." We were like, here are some of the things you will confront when you try to decolonize. We will never say that we decolonized a museum. We will say that this was an experimentation in decolonizing, because we did a lot of things wrong too.
I don't think any of us approach a project thinking, right, this is perfection. Check this out. It doesn't work like that. I think so much of what we do is experimental.
There is a tendency, though, for museums to kind of present case studies as if they were perfect, though, and say, this is exactly what we did. And this is how it ended up. And they'll kind of mention some of the problems, but they said it was all resolved. Or this is how we resolved it. And it's a really interesting way, because it's basically like doing an essay, right, where you conclude things. And we wanted to say, because we were really interested in decolonizing ethos, that this wasn't a tick box exercise. We didn't do it. It's not complete. We never wanted at any point someone to say, okay, you did it there. We're like, no, we started it and we have to do it again and we have to do it again. And we'll get better each time, but we'll never finish it because I don't think it's possible to decolonize museums in the first place. I think it's possible to decolonize our practice. And that only, your practice is only as good as how much you change it and how much you tweak it and learn from it. And
I think also how much will the institution is willing to change itself as well, and also embed that change for the future, because it's so easy to do something once or twice and then, right, I'm done now, let's go back to normal.
Yeah, and then you'll find that 20 years later people reference the project you once did that hasn't been built upon.
Yeah, God. Well, on that slightly depressing note.
Sorry. Let's hope that's not the case with the passes now.
No. Well, it hasn't been, because obviously it is inspiring other work, contemporary work. We mentioned right at the beginning that you've recently been appointed anthropology curator with a focus on social practice at the Horniman Museum. Now, that's an absolutely huge remit, because it's the global collections that they have, and also the newly curated World Gallery there. How do you plan to use this new gallery and the collections to engage members of the local community?
It is a huge remit, and it was the first time that job has been created at the Horniman. So there was a lot of really great scope to figure out what it meant to the Horniman with me as a person in that position, and to have quite a bit of creativity with it. The World Gallery is an amazing resource. It's not perfect. So I like to focus on decolonial practice, and I would say that the World Gallery is not a decolonial space, but a very strong anti-racist gallery. And it was done purposefully as an anti-racist gallery rather than a decolonizing gallery.
Could you explain what an anti-racist gallery is?
Yeah, so they were positioning themselves as really socially conscious space. A lot of decolonizing is about kind of undoing and challenging and very self-reflexive. It's kind of placing yourself within this canon of colonialism and kind of unpicking the legacy of that. Whereas an anti-racist gallery is much more about kind of creating unity. So they address stereotypes. So you'll kind of read in the introduction of Africa, like the overall message of the introduction of African Encounter is that Africa is a continent and that it's many things to many people, and it's, it's cities, it's jungles, it's also, it's many things. And then the Asian Encounter will say, like, Asia is the heart of civilization and the start of writing and that sort of thing. It almost kind of doesn't say the stereotype, but it does by its interpretation. And they do a lot of really great things. Like they make sure they don't suspend things in time. So they're really clear about when things are predominantly from the 1800s and kind of say, okay, they were only collected around this time. And having something contemporary in each space to show kind of continuation of cultures and practices and things that have survived or adapted or changed. But in the same way, they kind of keep these dichotomy of sort of pre-colonial, colonial, and then post-colonial is kind of back to pre-colonial, rather than understanding that the world is shaped and continued by the history of colonialism. So when you talk about America, you can't just talk about the First Nations people's survival. You have to also talk about kind of integration, adaptation. You have to talk about white America and black America if you're talking about America in a decolonial way. But in an anti-racist way, you kind of talk about the fact that these cultures didn't die. They did survive. Here they are. And they're present today, rather than saying, but also they're mixed race and they're also really, influenced by kind of Black American culture, or they live in this is actually a Latin-y area now. That sort of thing. And there's one really interesting display on refugees in the European Encounter. So the other thing is that it actually has a European Encounter as well, where a lot of world galleries ignore Europe. Absolutely
no. Europe is just the place that did the collecting.
Yeah,
right?
it's from the outside.
Some power and authority.
Yeah, it's not ever contextualized as an anthropological space. So they have the European Encounter and talks about Italy, Sweden, Poland, and England. But they have a refugee narrative as part of the Mediterranean story in coming into Italy. And it's really interesting and it's really moving. And there's like a helm of a ship that was taken from Italy that had been used to transport refugees from Libya to Italy. Everybody on the ship survived, but it's a very violent object. It's a cut ship head as well, so it looks broken. There's a video of how it was harvested, so you hear this chainsaw noise as it's cut from the rest of the ship. And then you have these poems that are used as interpretation, and they were done by asylum seekers that work with a museum. They did a kind of interpretive project. And it sounds really great because it's about kind of people being given voices to talk about their own history and own narrative. But in the video of the making, you hear one of the refugees kind of talk about the process, and she's smiling. But she basically says, going through the process of writing this was so difficult because it made us all relive that moment. We'd all done that journey, and it was really hard. She's smiling the whole time. And to me, it's an example of when a story is about someone, and maybe by them, but it's not for them. That's not an encounter for a refugee to go to and feel safe. That's an encounter for somebody who may have prejudices to go to and have their mind changed. So that's the example of anti-racist versus decolonial to me. But the structure of the gallery itself lends itself really well to being to doing social practice. So basically, they make a point of saying there's no advocacy for homogenization. The world is different, and everybody in the world is has different cultures and experience and understand our world differently. But there's common humanity anywhere you go, and this can be mapped against at least 4 core themes. One is that we all raise children, we all remember our dead, we all celebrate our life, and we all tell stories. Very basic, but it's really a great tool for kind of filling in the gaps that are in the gallery. So talking about LGBTQ stories, for example, is really easy through those 4 themes. And I'm currently trying to pursue a project to tell Caribbean narratives using those themes as well. And to create more intimate narratives. So it's less about kind of like, okay, let's think about the world from these big historical moments and actually think, okay, let's say Windrush. How do we talk about the Windrush narrative from within families, within the idea that these group of immigrants came and had to raise their children in England? And actually, it's not necessarily about the impact on now a multicultural city. They're real families. The Windrush scandal affects real families. When we're remembering the dead, it's personal. We do it on a large scale too, but mostly it's individuals who mourn their dead.
And how do you go about displaying that, or do you not display that kind of work?
I haven't gone to the display aspect yet.
Oh, fair enough, yeah.
But yeah, I'm trying a method of collecting from the story out. So having kind of scenarios where people share stories or just spend time with each other and see what objects come about, what stories naturally come about, and working backwards that way, which is for me what I understood social practice to be, actually.
Oh, that's really interesting. Okay.
To have as many people involved as possible, to have it driven by conversation and social activities. So, for example, I hosted a big meal, and lots of different people came together for this meal. We planned the meal, and we had the meal. We recorded the meal, and that's where the stories are.
Wow, see, as an ancient historian, to me, it's fascinating to hear that, because obviously I don't really work like that. Like, my people have been dead for about 2,500 years. It's a long time ago.
Can't host a dinner party.
It would be a very strange one.
Seance.
Exactly, yeah. How disturbing would that be? So you were elected to the Museum Association Board, which was extremely exciting last year.
Yes.
How are you working with them to institute change in the sector?
So the reason I applied to be a board member was, in all the decolonial conversations you get to, someone will always be like, but where are the board members? Where are the change makers? Where are the directors? And then the position came up, and I was like, you know what, maybe I'll become one of those people. And then I'll know where they are.
Absolutely.
And it's been amazing because I've met so many more senior members of staff than I ever thought I would. And I know them on a first-name basis. And I'll go to conferences now, and the director of the museum will come up to me and be like, oh, hello, nice to see you again. And I'm like, I still find this weird. Because, I'm fairly junior. I'm definitely very young. I'm almost always the youngest person in the room when these conversations are going on. But then you have their ear. And actually, that is where you make those changes, because that is when someone like me can take aside a director and be like, but don't you think it's terrible? Like, do you think this is acceptable? And actually, you're seen on a senior enough footage that you're not being rude. You're actually being a critical friend, or somebody who has the right to kind of say, why isn't this happening? Can you explain it to me?
And also, you're not being dismissed.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you're not just sort of being sort of labelled as a troublemaker or an awkward person.
Yeah.
And you know,
you could be the awkward board member, but yeah.
Hey, it's important. I think it's important to inject that little bit of awkwardness, because otherwise you just sort of have the same old thing going again and again.
And I have to, like, my proudest moment actually within the board has been that we did Collections 2030, and we're doing other like papers and recommendations for the institution. And since I've been there, and I have been able to advocate openly, and it's been taken on board, for restitution and repatriation. I've been able to say, but okay, we're talking about collections. What about repatriation when we're talking about the future? And then someone's gone off and done the research and be like, yeah, okay, repatriation.
That's incredible. Well done.
Yeah. So that's been pretty cool.
I can imagine. It'd be interesting to see what happens with that, actually, after we're watching that space.
Well, Collections 2030, which is the Museum Association's document on the future of collections, says we need creative disposal policies, and we need to consider stuff like repatriation, restitution seriously as means of understanding our collections as we go forward. So it's not like out and out saying let's repatriate, but it's very clearly saying look into this.
Absolutely, at least have it on your agenda or radar at least.
Yeah.
What do you think the future holds for you as a curator, and what kind of challenges do you think you're likely to face next? That's a big question. I know there's a couple of big questions there.
I have no idea what challenges I'm going to face next. Hopefully I can face them when they come, and I'll have allies and support and the emotional stamina to deal with it. I used to always say that my 10-year plan, so when I started the museum, so now it must be my 5-year plan, was that I was going to eventually own my own institution. I was going to make the Institute of Jamaica or its equivalent real. I've always been really interested in figuring out how to make a space to remember the things that are important for people in the Caribbean outside of kind of the framework that was given to us through colonialism. I've been really interested in not museums, but more like cultural centers around the world and how they do that. And really starting from the question of what do we need to remember, and then working backwards through that. So my dream would be to have an institution like that. And a part of me thinks that it won't take the shape of a museum. It'll take inspiration from a museum. But the more I work in museums, the less likely I think that they can be decolonized. And I'd like to make a decolonial space. So it wouldn't have objects at its center. It would have people and the stories first. And then the how comes after the what and the why. So that would be my dream. But I imagine that would be difficult in terms of the realities of managing a space and people and having an idea like that and getting funding for it.
Funding, yes.
Funding. And I value people's time, so I want to pay people fairly. Yeah, so that will probably be really interesting. But that's one of the reasons I really like being a board member. I actually took it on a lot to understand large-scale business models as well for some professional development. So I'm understanding how you balance the books. I'm understanding how when you say you're giving a 3% pay rise, what does that actually mean for your business plan and the budgets and deficits and that sort of thing, which is kind of boring, but so important.
Oh, it's essential. You don't have a functioning institution without understanding that.
Yeah. So that would be my dream. I don't know if it will be 5 years, or if it will be 20 years, or if it will be 50 years, but it's still the aim. I'm still trying to figure out all the pieces I need to find to get that to be something that could be robust and real.
Well, having seen what you've managed to achieve so far in just, 5 years, I'm pretty sure this is going to happen, actually. Can I ask you, you mentioned that, you don't think museums can be decolonised.
Yeah.
Why?
I don't think they can be decolonised because we can't go back. They will always have been a product of colonization. I think our practices can be decolonised, but our foundations can be post-colonial. So we can eventually stop replicating colonialism. But it will always be within the foundations of what we've done. New museums, I suppose, have a space to be non-colonial spaces. But spaces like the British Museum will never be decolonized. It's its foundation's heart, the people who've worked here for years, like there's too much legacy. And if individuals try to decolonize it, it will drive them insane. Individuals can individuals can decolonize their own practice, and they can decolonize the practice around themselves. But there is something about a space like this that is much more than the sum of the people who work there, even if they have the best intentions. Because, I mean, a lot of the practitioners of the British Museum are amazing, and they're doing amazing work, and they're really thoughtful and trying really hard to undo or to fight against some of this legacy. But I don't think it can disappear. So I think it's just one of those things where you kind of have to like add it into your bag and say, okay, we have a colonial legacy, but our practice is not decolonial. So we're not decolonized, but we're moving forward in a way that's not replicating the same violences. We'll make new violences, but they'll be different.
Oh my God, yes. Violence is not sort of a key part of my approach. Thank you. That's really thoughtful. I really appreciate that. Oh. That was me, Sushma Jansari, in conversation with Rachael Minott, Inclusion and Change Manager at the National Archives. For me, a particularly powerful and thought-provoking point that came out of our conversation is Rachael's belief that it is not actually possible to decolonise museums at all. Instead, she emphasises the value of experimentation and continually improving your practice. As she says, your practice is only as good as how much you change it and how much you tweak it and learn from it.